Alright, so this is going to be a quick tutorial on a really helpful tool when it comes to render management in Maya called contribution maps. Now, I'm going to assume that you've had experience setting up render passes before, working with the render layer manager, um, and maybe at least some basic idea of compositing, so you know exactly what render passes you're going to want and how you're going to use them. So, when it comes to setting up render passes in Maya, usually one of two methods is used. The first being, creating individual render layers where you'd, select your desired parts of your scene, add them to your render layer, and then you'd use like layer overrides to, uh, you know, basically output the desired render pass. So like you could do layer overrides for both for pretty much everything, and you'd have to actually configure each pass in order to get the desired render pass results that you wanted. And this can be a very tedious process concerning you have to set up a new render layer for each pass. And when it comes to batch rendering, everything has to be recalculated per render layer. So it's very inefficient. The other method is using the render pass manager, where you can actually, go into the render settings, render pass tab, and if you create a new render pass, you have a whole set of presets which you can also modify after the fact. And what you can do is, so I'll go ahead and select all the objects in my layer, and I'll add them to a new render pass. I'll name this beauty. Okay, because this does incorporate into contribution maps. So if you don't know how to do this already, I'm going to go and walk you through using the render pass manager, because we're going to be combining using the render pass manager with contribution maps. So how this works is you have this entire set of preset passes which you can create. So some common ones that say I want a beauty pass, which is just going to be a raw render. If I want a diffuse, I'm going to want to use diffuse material with color. Most likely I'm going to want a matte layer. Let's see. I'll also want a raw shadow. Actually, I'll come back to that one. Let's do a specular and a reflection. Because, well, actually, let's do a raw shadow as well. Because for this particular scene, I'm going to need all of those elements. All those elements are present. I have these three polygonal objects present in my scene with a basic lighting setup, and I have, the sphere, for example, has reflection and specularity, so I'm definitely going to want to pass for that. Basically, when it comes to passes, you need to recognize, the material properties in your scene and what exactly is going on, so that when you set up your render passes, you have all the render passes that you're going to need in the end. So, you can create a pass prefix. In this case, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to wait till I get to contribution maps. You create and close your passes once you've, picked those. In order to edit them, all you do is double click on the pass, and it opens up these options here. And I'll go through these in more detail once I get to the contribution maps portion. Now, at this point, these passes are just floating here in a void. They're not actually being applied to our render. And what you need to do to apply a render pass preset to your actual render is you want to select your render layer, and then you're going to want to select your render passes, make sure they're all highlighted, and you're going to want to hit this button, Associate Selected Pass with Current Render Layer. Now what that does is it is associating each pass with a specific render layer. What that means is when it comes time to render the beauty render layer, for example, which I associated them with, it's going to pump out all of these passes during render time at little to no cost when it comes to that overall render time. So it's actually going to just render the whole scene, and it's going to deviate all of these other passes within the same time frame. All right, and you'll notice when I select the master layer, these passes are no longer associated. They no longer show up in the associated passes box. That's because I associated them specifically with the beauty pass. Okay, so this means that say you had something more complicated and you needed to actually use more than one render layer, you could associate passes, any number of passes with any number of render layers. Okay, so now that hopefully you have an understanding of how those work. I'm going to delete those, and I'm going to go right into contribution maps. So the limitations of the first method of setting up render passes are pretty obvious. You have a lot of control, but like I said, the render time drastically increases. It's very annoying to deal with. And then the render passes themselves, well, they are more condensed, you know, and it makes things a lot more manageable. They still have their limitations. That's where contribution maps come into play. So what a contribution map allows you to do is set up a render pass specifically for specific objects in your scene rather. So let's say that I wanted to have a render pass just for this sphere. All right. So this sphere has specular and reflective properties. Well, the rest of the scene doesn't. And maybe I want to be able to, specifically tweak just the sphere. I don't know. Maybe I want to make things more manageable. Sure, I could just render out a complete specular pass, but this just basically gives you a lot more flexibility when it comes to compositing. So in order to create a contribution map, you want to select the object in your scene, and you always want to be working off a render layer that's not the master layer when it comes to contribution maps. So I'll select the object in my scene that I want to create a contribution map for, which means I'm going to be isolating this object when it comes to setting up render passes. Okay, so then I'm going to right click on my render layer, go to Pass Contribution Maps, and I'm going to click Create Pass Contribution Map and Add Selected. There's also the option for Create Empty Pass Contribution Map or Associate with Existing Map. All that means is it works the same way as render layers or display layers. If you create a render pass, like for example here, if I create a pass contribution map and add selected, it's going to add the sphere. Okay, I'm going to rename this sphere pass just for ease of memory. The naming convention doesn't matter as long as it's a unique name. And at any point, if I want to add more objects, I would just select the object, right-click the pass, add selected objects. I could remove selected objects. Most likely, self-explanatory. So, if you're ever unsure which objects you've actually put on the pass, you can right-click, select objects, and it's going to select the object in your scene that's associated with that pass, or it's on that contribution map. Right? So I'm going to go ahead and repeat the same process. Create a pass contribution map for each of the objects in my scene. So I got the cylinder, pass. Whoops. Get confusing. Okay, got the cube pass. And I'm just keeping the naming convention, uniform so that if I ever had to come back and edit things, it would be very clear what I was doing. Room pass. Okay, so now that I've set up a contribution map for each of the objects in my scene, being the cube, cylinder, sphere, and room, I'm going to want to open up the render pass manager, once again in the render settings, passes tab, and I'm going to want to start creating passes that I want for each of these contribution maps. So I'll start with a sphere, and this is where the pass prefix becomes important. So I'll make the pass prefix sphere underscore, and that's just going to make it really easy for me to remember which one of these passes is meant to be associated with which contribution map. Okay, so for the sphere, I'm going to want I'm going to go ahead and skip the beauty this time, and I'm just going to go straight for the compositing passes that I'm going to need. So I'm going to go ahead and get diffuse with material color, and that's the best one to use for the diffuse pass. I'm going to get the matte pass, and since this has specular and reflection, I'm going to add a reflection, and I'm going to add a specular without shadows. Okay, and that's good. So I'm going to create and close, and I have created all of these new render pass presets here, which I'm next going to, once again, select the layer. I'm going to associate them with a layer. Now at this point, these passes are only associated with a layer. And even though I've named them sphere underscore, since they're only associated with a layer, if I rendered this out, what you'll notice is that if I go to my render passes here and I look at, say, the specular shadow, for example, it's including every object in the scene. All right, and the reason for that is because although I've named these passes sphere underscore with a prefix sphere underscore, I haven't actually associated them with the contribution map. So regardless of the naming convention, as long as if these render passes are only associated with the render layer itself and not any of the contribution maps, it's going to produce these passes for the entire scene. So what I need to do is scroll down further, and I have this new box here, associate pass contribution map. So in here it lists all my contribution maps. So I created these render passes specifically for the sphere. So I'm going to go to my sphere pass. I'm going to select all of these render pass presets here, and I'm going to associate them with the sphere layer, or the sphere contribution map rather. Okay, so now when I render this, if I go to the render pass preview here, and I look at my sphere specular, you can see that the specular now only shows up for the sphere by itself, okay? And that's because I've associated the pass with a specific contribution map. And now that means that whenever I go to batch render, that those passes that I just associated with the sphere contribution map will only be present for the properties of the sphere itself in the scene and nothing else. Okay, so the other thing here is actually looking into the pass properties. So for your diffuse pass, I use the diffuse material color preset, and then you have the number of channels. Now the number of channels is the RGB. So by default, the diffuse material has 3 channels, so it's only got RGB. If I want to add an alpha for it, then I want to set this number to 4. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. And then the frame buffer type is relative to the the frame buffer that you're using in your scene. So for this particular scene, I'm actually using 32-bit float because I'm working in a linear workflow in Maya. So you're going to want to make sure that that correlates with whatever your frame buffer is, which you can find in the quality tab down under frame buffer. Okay. And then color profile, I'm just going to use the default because I'm using enable color management, so it's just going to pull that information from there. And filtering and all these things, you can just skip that. Now holdout is pretty important. What holdout means is when holdout is checked, it's actually going to cut a hole in your scene when there's a foreground object in front of that another object. So for example, if I were to render out a pass for the diffuse of the room, because there's these 3 other objects in front of it, the actual diffuse pass for the room is going to have this giant hole where these objects are. So there's going to be just a transparent space here in the room layer. Okay, so if I wanted to actually have the room layer, let's say I wanted to have the room layer without that hole, I would uncheck holdout, which means when it came to rendering the specific passes for the room, it would actually render everything behind the other objects. So it would almost be like it was isolating the room by itself in the scene and rendering everything that the camera could see. And so in a lot of cases, I like to do that for the background objects. It just helps to eliminate a lot of compositing issues that you might have. And either way, I end up using the matte layers to, alpha out or basically constrain the parts of the layer that I want to be seen anyway. So for pretty much every object in the diffuse pass, I like to uncheck holdout. So it's going to render out the entire object regardless of whether it's behind another object or not. Okay. So another thing that comes up here are these other options here. You have use geometry, visible, and reflections. And that means, like for example, on the sphere, it has reflectivity. And if I don't check this option, when it renders out the reflectivity pass that I've set up, it's not going to actually show any of the other objects in the scene in the reflections. Okay, so if you wanted to have the other objects in the scene show up in the reflections of the sphere, you'd have to check hid geometry, visible, and reflections. Same goes with refractions and so forth. It's pretty self-explanatory if you're not sure. If something's working, you can always just test it. Now, in this case, I'm working on the diffuse pass, which has no reflective properties, so I'm not going to want to check that. So as far as the diffuse goes, you know, diffuse material color for the type. I'm going to use 4 channels, so I have an alpha. Set the frame buffer to fit your scene, and uncheck holdout. All right, and I'll come back to these options when I get to the reflection pass that I've set up. So next up is the matte. Now the matte is going to generate a luminance matte, which means it's going to be a black and white matte. Okay, so this only has 3 channels. So for this matte, I am going to just leave everything default. I'm going to leave holdout checked on because this is where I want to have a matte that's going to actually eat away at where the shape, where the particular object um, is behind another. So in this case, when I have holdout checked, it's going to generate a matte, which I think I can show you here what that's going to look like. Okay, so for here, I have the sphere, and this is the matte it's generating, where the cylinder is actually cutting away at the sphere, so I can use this when it comes to compositing to alpha out my sphere in the scene. Okay. Now, the next pass is the reflection pass. So again, I'm going to set that to 4 channels, so I have an alpha. And I'm going to go ahead and leave holdout, or I'm going to uncheck holdout because I have a matte that I can use to composite that in any way. And I'm going to want to check hidden geometry, visible and reflection, because this is the reflection pass, and if I don't check that, when I render it out, I'm not going to be able to see the cylinder, for example, or the room show up in the reflection of the sphere. Okay? And then finally, the specular pass. Once again, 4 channels. I want to set this 32. Actually, I didn't do that for the reflection. Make sure that's set to your frame buffer. I'm going to uncheck holdout. Specularity, I don't have to worry about any of these other options here. Of course, if there's anything that uses transparency, it'll usually automatically check that for you. So if I load up my render passes here, I've got a pass for the sphere matte. I've got a pass for the sphere diffuse. Again, since I unchecked holdout, I'm just going to be using my matte to alpha this out. I have my reflection with all of the objects in the scene, which is exactly what I wanted. Okay. And I have my specular as well. So now you're just basically going to want to repeat the same process for every object in your scene. However, because each of these objects have different material properties, it's going to dictate which passes you're going to want for them. So for example, if I go ahead and work on my cylinder here, so once again I'll go to the beginning and I will create a new render pass, and I only have a specular and diffuse property for this cylinder. So what I'm going to want to do is again a diffuse material color, and then I'm just going to want the specular without shadows. And I'm going to go back to the prefix. I'm going to name this one cylinder underscore create and close. I'm also going to want a matte pass. That's right. So matte, create that one as well. And at any point you can create more passes and associate them with your render layer, or your contribution map. There's complete flexibility there. So again, first thing I have to do is select my passes, select my render layer itself, associate it with the render layer. And again, at this point, they're only associated with the render layer, so I need to associate them with the contribution map. Going down, selecting my contribution map, and associating those with that contribution map. And then going back in, setting up my render passes. Again, 4 channels for RGBA, frame buffer type, making sure that matches up. Hold out on or off, whether it's needed or not. Again, the matte layer is always usually pretty much set up the way you want it by default. Specular shadow. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and skip ahead and set up the rest of the render passes for the remaining objects in the scene. But you may be wondering, since I've set up all of these render pass presets, why can't I reuse them for the different contribution maps that I have? So for example, at the beginning I set up the diffuse, matte, reflection, specular passes for the sphere, but again, the naming convention is purely reference um, for me when it comes to working with this. So you may be wondering, well, why can't I just associate the same passes with a different contribution map? As in, at render time, won't it just spit out the same passes for the specific object and separate them out? And this actually won't happen. If I associated the same passes for the sphere, or these same passes for two contribution maps, in the end, it would combine both of those passes into the same render pass. So if I associated the diffuse material pass here with both the sphere and the cylinder, when it came to rendering that out and I loaded up the diffuse render pass, I would see both of those combined. And that's just based off the naming convention. So you actually do need to create individual render passes for every single contribution map. Unless you are in a scenario where maybe you wanted the same pass for just two contribution maps, or an isolated number of contribution maps in your scene, in which case you could associate them with multiple contribution maps. But at that point, it would probably just be better for you to have placed the same objects in the same contribution map to begin with. The other thing too is, of course, as we saw at the beginning with render layers, if you created a render pass, like let's say I'm gonna need an ambient occlusion, and I'm also going to probably want a camera depth for depth of field. Let's say that I wanted to have those passes associated with the entire scene itself, and let's say I also wanted a master beauty. So I would just go ahead and give these a prefix. Let's call this all, create and close. And now I'm just going to associate these just with a render layer. So that means that although I have all these other passes which are connected to specific contribution maps, I've also set up these three other passes which are going to be applied to the entire scene. So most likely you're going to want to use these, or maybe you'll do these in a different way. But to set up the ambient occlusion, I'll go and give it an alpha channel, set it to my frame buffer type. And in this case, I'm going to go ahead and check on use local AO settings so I can actually configure these the way I want. I'm going to go ahead and set this to a value of 32. Give it a spread of 0.8. Max distance of 5. This is just the settings that I'm using in a current project, so you could set these to whatever you want. The number of rays, the more you increase it, the higher quality you're going to get. And the max distance is, I'd say usually you want to keep the spread and the max distance to about this number. It's just going to reduce your render time. All right, and I'm going to leave everything else unchecked. The one thing with the ambient occlusion pass in the scene passes, you just want to make sure you go to your features tab and make sure that ambient occlusion is checked on. Otherwise, this pass won't work. Okay. And so now that I have that all set up, I'm going to go to the beauty pass. I'm just going to set that to 32-bit. Don't necessarily need any of these checked, but it's just going to render out a raw beauty pass for the entire scene. So if you were to just select your layer and hit the render button by default, that's basically what the beauty pass would output. Okay. And then my depth remapped. Now for setting up a depth pass, this is a little bit more, or involves a little bit more work here, but basically I use a depth remap because it gives you more control over making sure this is going to render correctly. So essentially what you want to do for that is go to your perspective view, and you're going to want to use the create measure tools distance tool, and you can just click in your scene and it's going to actually measure out the distance of your scene here. Okay, and the reason why you want to do that, so if I go back to my render cam, go back to my depth map options, you're going to want to set your minimum and maximum buffer value. So the minimum value is at the beginning point of where the camera is. Okay, so since I'm measuring the distance between where my camera is and the edge of the scene, I'm going to leave my minimum buffer value at like 0 or 1 or 0.001, whatever. and then I'm going to set my maximum buffer value at the end of my scene, which was about 20. And now, when I render this out, it's going to generate a pretty decent z-depth pass without, or an optimized z-depth pass. Okay, so that's all there is for that. All right, and so now at this point, I'm going to go ahead and skip ahead and set up the rest of the render passes for the remaining objects in the scene. Alright, so at this point I've created the remaining render passes that I needed. I also created this shadow raw pass for the entire scene, which is going to give me my shadows as well. All I did for that, same steps. I have holdout checked on though. And just going through, I have my, uh, let's see, my cube pass, which I've associated only a diffuse and matte, since it's basically a Lambert material. My cylinder pass has a diffuse, matte, and a specular based on the properties I gave the material. My room pass is just a diffuse, and my sphere pass is diffuse, matte, a reflection, and a specular. So now when it comes to rendering this out, I'm going to have all my individual passes for each of the individual objects in my scene, as well as an ambient occlusion for the whole thing, a beauty pass for the whole thing, a z-depth pass of the whole thing, and the shadow pass for the entire scene. And once I hit render, all of these render passes that I've set up in this layer will be generated within about the same time frame as if I were to simply click the render button and generate a raw beauty pass or a raw beauty render. So this becomes incredibly, incredibly useful, as you can probably see. And everything is very easy to manage as well. So I'm going to go ahead and render this out in an EXR format. So what OpenEXR is going to do is it's going to actually combine all of the different render passes into a single file, which it will increase your render pass management even further when it comes to compositing. All right. So for that, all I had to do was set my file type to OpenEXR. I'm only going to render a single frame, otherwise you'd want to use one of these other file extension conventions here. For now, I'm just going to use name.extension single frame. Make sure that I'm rendering from my render camera. You set your resolution, all that. I guess it's important to note that a lot of these passes require 32-bit in order to actually render them, as well as an OpenEXR requires that as well. So I'll go ahead and give you a quick rundown to make sure that you're working in 32-bit linear if you're not already working in that. And I'll probably make another tutorial that goes more detail into that at some point as well. But all that requires is enabling color management, going to your quality tab, making sure your frame buffer is set to RGBA float 32, and then in your render view, what you want to do is make sure you go to display, make sure that 32-bit float is selected, click color management, set your image profile to linear, leave the display color profile at sRGB, and then you're going to want to go to save image option box, make sure that save color managed image is selected, apply and close, and that's pretty much it. Okay, so now I'm going to go ahead and render this out, and I'm going to go ahead and go into bringing all these passes and compositing them in After Effects. So here's a composite that I've already set up in After Effects, but I'm going to go ahead and walk you through the basic steps of working with a EXR in After Effects. And then I'm just going to have to assume that you have at least some experience with compositing. I'm not going to go into great detail in the compositing portion. So the first thing you want to do, of course, is take your EXR, import it into the scene, and then drop it into a new comp. Okay? And the other thing is you want to make sure that you're set up in 32-bit. You want to select your working space, which I'm using sRGB, this option here, if you just want to refer to that there. And then you're going to want to check on linearize working space. it's going to make sure that it's reading the 32-bit information in the EXR. Okay. If you're not working in 32-bit when you're doing this, then just leave it at default. Okay. So now what I have here is I have this EXR file, but I don't see any of my passes. In order to access your passes, you need to use an effect called extractor. And that's an effect that comes with After Effects. There are a lot of plugins for this kind of work process, but we're just going to be using the default extractor. You don't want to drop the extractor effect on top of your footage, and still nothing's happened. Now, although nothing's happened at this point, all of your passes are actually contained in this one file. To access them, you want to click right here on this extractor RGB. Just click right here. You'll get this pointer finger icon. It's going to open up this little menu here. And now if I scroll through, I'm looking at all of my different passes in terms of RGBA. So I've got an ambient occlusion, red channel, green channel, blue channel, A channel, my diffuse for every single object. Pretty much everything is contained this um, in this single EXR. So in order to load in each pass, I'm going to go ahead and start with the sphere RGB. Now, this is a very annoying effect to work with, considering I can't actually, pull it out farther so I can read, what I'm actually looking at completely. And these naming conventions are very long. But just based off of experience with this thus far, um, the R channel is the bottommost channel, and then it goes GBA. So I'll go through the process. I want to associate the sphere diffuse red channel with the red here. And I want to go back and do the green channel. Okay. And then the blue channel. And then finally the alpha channel, which will be right here. When I hit OK, it's now isolated that pass. So I'm going to click my layer. I'm going to call this sphere diffuse, and I'm going to duplicate it. I'm going to name this sphere specular. I'm going to duplicate it again. I'm going to name this sphere reflection. Okay, so I'm going to go to the sphere specular, and all I'm going to do is now I'm going to go to the same process, go to my specular for the sphere, R channel, green channel, blue, and finally the alpha. Alright, and then I'm going to go ahead and set that to a blending mode like linear dodge. Okay. And, actually, so what's happened here is it hasn't actually interpreted the alpha channel for the specular property properly. So if you ever encounter an issue like this where, like let's say if I isolate the specular, I see, oh, well, there's nothing here. And that's because the alpha channel for the specular wasn't rendered properly or just didn't interpret it. So that's fine because we don't actually need an alpha for that necessarily. So I'll just hit copy, which is going to use the master alpha. If I hit OK, now you can see that I have a specular showing up here. Okay. So then I'll go ahead and do my reflection. And most likely the reflection is going to have the same issue. There's probably a way to correct that, but for now we don't necessarily need it because we're going to be using a compositing mode. We also have our matte as well, so if I wanted to pull an alpha at the end, I can show you how we can do that. Okay, so I'll go ahead and do my sphere reflections. So my sphere reflection R, sphere reflection blue, green, blue, and I'll just leave the alpha at copy. Okay, and I'll go ahead and set this to linear dodge as well. The reason why I like to use linear dodge is because it actually bleeds in a lot of the color from the diffuse when you're compositing that. Okay, and so now I've set up my sphere, and you're going to just want to go ahead and do the same thing for the rest of your passes using this process. Now there's actually a plugin, I believe, that you can use which will automatically extract and set up each of your passes based on the naming conventions used. So that's something that you're definitely going to want to look into. I don't actually do a lot of compositing, 32-bit EXR compositing in After Effects. So if I find that plugin, I'll go ahead and just post it in the comments or something. Um, but yeah, obviously you could tell that this is the more tedious phase of working with an EXR, which is why people have created scripts and plugins to, automate this process for you. So, so switching back over to this composite that I've already completed, I've used the same general technique to separate out all of my render passes here. And then I've used some very simple compositing techniques to combine all the passes into the final scene, as well as added some just really quick beautification adjustments as well. Um, so if we take a quick look at this, I've just got a very simple sky that I created with a ramp on a solid. I've got the room diffuse, which looks like I may have forgotten to uncheck shadows or something's going on there, but it's not an issue. I've got my cube diffuse, my sphere diffuse, cylinder diffuse. Then I've started to add in my specularity and reflectivity. Specularity for the cylinder. I've multiplied the ambient occlusion into the scene. I have my shadow, which I've multiplied over the rest of the scene as well. I've added my depth of field, and for that I just am using the camera lens blur, and I've piped in a Z depth pre-comp, so you can see that I've actually applied a levels adjustment in order to crush the light and dark values of this map here in order to dictate more accurately where I want the blur to happen. And I've inverted it. Okay, and the reason why I had to pre-comp it is because the camera lens blur won't actually interpret those changes unless it's pre-comped. So if we take a look back at the main comp here, I've got my depth of field adjustment. You can see if I turn this on and off, I've added that depth of field using the Z depth pass that I generated. And then I've got a exposure adjustment here where it looks like I toned down the red channel here. If I take a look at the individual channel here, I've toned down the red exposure and whatnot. And then I've made this bloom adjustment layer, which is essentially just some saturation, some looks adjustments, and a very slight blur on the scene. And that's all there is to it. So if I wanted to render this out, I would just add it to the render queue and set my render settings up and render that out, and it would be good to go. So hopefully at this point you have a pretty good idea of how contribution maps work and how useful they are, as well as using the render pass manager in Maya to set up all your render pass settings, rendering out all those passes into an EXR, and then compositing that EXR in After Effects.